Well, welcome everyone to, I believe, our last Spilling the Tea event of the fall semester. Um, so I'm excited about this. We get to welcome Donnie Smith, EC grad of 2011, currently the admission director for Redwood Day School, and that's in California, correct, Donnie?
Correct. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Donnie, I'm just going to hand it over to you. If you would like to, just give us a little bit of opening context about yourself. Tell us your name, about your time at EC. How you got to your current position. Any of your path so far that you'd like to share. We just love to have you start that way.
Sure. Well, it's funny because my one of my classmates, Hannah, who I overlap with, we both work in independent schools, and so my name is Donnie Smith. I'm director of admissions at Redwood Day School, which is a K through 8 independent school in Oakland, California. I think we're fairly progressive. I'm called Mr. Donnie with all the kids, so that's been really really great. I started out my career at a nonprofit called A Better Chance, placing kids of color in independent day and boarding schools around the country. And so these are typically high performing students whose families kind of want a different educational option than public school. Um, as I was doing that work, I actually realized that I wasn't the person making any sort of decisions. I was just helping families navigate a process that was also just kind of like what happens behind the scenes. And so I actually took a leap of faith in this weird way. The first school that I ever worked at actually reached out to me directly and didn't know that I had a job. My resume was outdated and ended up going through the process thinking that I would stay at A Better Chance. And then I ended up going, 6 months later to go work at a boarding school called the Cambridge School of Weston. And so I was a dorm parent. I was assistant director of admissions. I helped with multicultural recruitment. And that's one thing that I really think kind of kept me in education, particularly in independent schools, is the sense of community, the culture is extremely important to me. And so, one thing about Earlham that I really loved was that when I was a tour guide, I was able to connect and engage with people who were very interested in Earlham. And so, for me to be able to live my life in a way to share stories and narratives and experiences about why this place or why this for your child, or also connecting with students, is really, really powerful. And so, I continued to kind of, work in boarding schools for about 5 or 6 years. Then I took another leap of faith, and then I jumped over to the day school world, which I never thought I would do. And I have no interest in ever going back to boarding. Maybe one day, maybe when I have a partner or I'm married, but right now, no interest. And so I went to go work at a quick Quaker day school called Brooklyn Friends, preschool through 12th grade, 900 students. And I did middle school admissions. I taught ninth grade Quakerism, which was actually one of the best experiences of my life. Um, and I think, the thing that is really that continues to connect the dot for me is one community, but also students. And I think that anyone who's in education, you really, really should love students. And I know that for Earlham grads, a lot of Earlham grads go into the public education sector. And it's something that person me and Hannah always talk about is that, independent schools can be really, really amazing places, particularly for people who are interested in I think that the beautiful part about independent school education is the level of autonomy that teachers have in and outside of the classroom, and which is why I continue to stay. I think, I'm working at an independent school. I'm in a pandemic, and we have been open for our K through 6 students for about 2 weeks, and we have a robust distance learning program. And yes, there are true equity issues with that, and that's something that I battle with every day. And so I do this work because I want this education to be accessible to as many people as possible. But I also understand the need to have windows and mirrors. And so I want families of color who are coming through this process to see and feel comfortable when they're going through this process. I want families who say we don't have a lot of money, but we want to be a part of, something different than what we had as our own educational program. I want to be a part of that conversation with families. And so I think for people who are thinking about education, and particularly, there are so many different routes, and I definitely can get into that.
Help if I unmute myself. Um, Thank you so much. Can you tell us what are some of the specific responsibilities of the role of admissions director at Redwood, and how is that? What is it like, and how is that different from an admissions director working at say maybe a boarding school or even at a higher ed institution?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, independent school education, and I think anyone who works in a K through 12 or preschool through 12 environment where it's tuition charging school, um, it is not a priority, right? So it's not necessarily you have to go to independent school. And so I spend a lot of time, which I think is the beautiful part of it. I get to know each and every family who applies, right? So by the time a child enrolls into our program and they come, I know their names. So for example, I do curb duty, for example, every day. I do drop off and pick up, and I know each and every one of the kindergartners, right? But I enrolled each and every one of them. And so for families who choose this is a values proposition, right? And not to say that a family who chooses to send their kid to public school, that it's not, you're not thinking about the values and like kind of what your child needs. But this is something that families really have to think about, because this is something that you do not need in life, but families who are going through the process kind of want this for their child. And so the difference is that the level of engagement. So I don't have to travel anywhere really. I just work from my office. So that's really great. In boarding school, you definitely had to do that. In higher ed, you definitely have to do that. My market is actually not necessarily children, it's parents, right? These are the people or individuals who are going to write the check to pay for their children to go to independent school. But also, the kids are also a deep interest for me as well, because at the end of the day, I want a child to see this school as a place they can grow and they can learn. So for us, one of the beautiful parts is that we usually do our assessments on campus for kindergarten, K1, and students, obviously, most kids love to play on play structures. We have an awesome play structure. And typically, kids, when they leave, they go home and the parents talk to them about their day. They usually mention, I want to go to the school with the play structure, right? And so that's kind of like my marketing tool for me for K1. Is that a reason why families should pay $30,000 for the child to go to school? Absolutely not. But I think for many, many families, they're also thinking about the small classrooms, and also kind of the marketing, right? I think that a family who says, we're going to send our kid here, or any independent school in the country, are saying that we felt truly connected to the community, the culture, the environment. We believe in your mission. We see the work that you're doing. And so this work, unlike I would say higher ed, for example, higher ed, you have all of these people, right, who do all these different jobs, and independent schools do as well. Like we have major departments of like maybe marketing and communication. We have directors of equity and inclusion. But at the end of the day, a person who does admissions at a K through 12 or an independent school, the director is the person who needs to know all of these things. And so you need to know what it means to have a diverse institution, and you need to have a DEI lens, right? So that work to me is a part of everything that I do. So like I partner with my director of equity. I partner with our marketing and communications manager. I partner with our lower school head, for example, our division head. So, it's literally, to me, when I talk about community, I have to partner with each level of our community to understand the needs of the kinds of students that we can serve and the program that we're trying to offer, right? And so to be competitive in the market, I need to understand this is what the market looks like, and then can we meet these needs of these children who are coming into our community, right? And when you're also talking about independent school education, this is, I like to think about it very much so, like, and no cutting the cross at all, is that this is a luxury item. And so at the end of the day, there's sometimes you're dealing with families who are, who are paying the full tuition. You have families who are getting middle grants, low, small grants, large grants. And this is something where you're also trying to meet the needs of your consumer, right? So at the end of the day, we're an independent school, just like higher ed institution, private institutions that have an advancement office, and we raise money. And so, I'm constantly trying to make sure that we're making the right decision when we take a family. So at the end of the day, when we enroll a family into our program, we want to make sure that a family feels truly connected to who we are and what we're going to do. And they don't come in expecting that because we're paying tuition, we expect this, this, and this. And it's like, well, we don't do this, this, and this. So those are just kind of a few of the differences.
Wonderful. How does that translate kind of into the day-to-day duties? So what does that mean for a typical day for you? What does
Yeah.
that look like?
So now, because we're in a pandemic, so for 8 months, we're obviously living in a pandemic. My day typically starts. I mean, I'll give you the run through. So I usually wake up now about 6 o'clock in the morning, which is early because I hate the mornings, or I just like them. I don't hate. I just like them. And then I usually kind of get up now and I like start workout, which is a very unusual for me, but I've spent so much time at work that it's something I've implemented in my life. By 7:10, 7:15, I'm already out the door. I'm a 6-minute walk to work, which is like, I basically live at a boarding school, but I don't. And so I walk to work. I get to work, I settle in. I do not check email and I do not check voicemails or anything like that. I just kind of throw my bag down. and then I kind of prep myself for duty. So at 7:55, I'm on the curb and literally helping kids get out the car, directing them to their points of entry. So obviously in COVID, we have small pods, and really, connecting with the kids in the morning. That's the way I like to start my day. Obviously, I don't want to take temperatures of students. We take temperatures of every single child who steps foot on our campus, and check an app called Magnus Health to see, make sure that they're clear. And then typically my first duty of the day is really checking with my team. I have two team members who I work with, and I'm a leader in the sense that I don't believe that people walk behind me. They are walking right beside me in all the work that we're doing. And so we check in kind of what's happening, what we're doing, what needs to be done for the day. I usually kind of jump on to my first meeting of the day. It's either Zoom or I need to catch up on email. I'm a mover, so I'm a person who really does value the sense of being outside of my office. So I'll go out and, hang out with the kids at recess. I'll go to snack time and talk to the kids about what's going on. And then typically, in a day, like a lot of Zooms. So I do a lot of parent chats right now because of COVID. We're doing a lot of intentional work around engaging with our parents and understanding kind of what they're looking for in a school. Obviously sit on a leadership team. So once a week I have a leadership team meeting and really understanding kind of what's happening, what communications are going out, what plans we have to make. And obviously, to reopen in person, there's a lot of planning that happens, even from an admission standpoint. And so I've spent more time, I would say, really planning the nit and gritty. So we open houses to, how we're going to get to know the students, what points of contact we're going to have. That is the stuff that literally we had to figure out this year. And so my typical day, starts, I get here at like 7:15. I'm usually done at 5, kind of 5:30. And then I still take work home to kind of get a few last emails done, and to prepare for the next day. And then typically now, because we're in admission season, we have a few evening events. So we're starting kind of parent events to connect our parents to our community and our programming.
Yeah, wonderful. So going back a little bit, you talked a little bit in, well, both of your previous answers about, how you got involved in education. But I kind of wanted to ask, this might end up being a confusing question. But I know you majored in English, correct?
Correct.
So at what point did you know you wanted to go into education, and where did you see that change from where you originally saw yourself going into, when you started and you chose the major with your English major?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great question. So when I came to Earlham, and I chose Earlham because I knew that I wanted a different educational experience. And, in all honesty, I knew that if I didn't go to college in Indiana, I probably would never go to Indiana, honestly. And so I took a leap of faith, and I think that we all do no matter where we go in the world. And it was the right decision. And so I came to Earlham and I thought that I would major in politics. I took a politics course. I walked out and was just like, this is not for me. And then I doubled up on another history course. I took a class with Mary Lacey, called Irish Literature. And I realized that that was what I wanted to do with my life. I had an amazing advisor, Joanne Quiones, who was my English professor and dear friend, companion, pretty much. I love her beyond words. And I knew that I wanted to focus on like literature, particularly by underrepresented groups. I thought that I wanted to be an English teacher. And so I actually went through the process of looking for jobs to teach English. And, to be very honest, and I think that most people have this, I think that so many people who think about education think only about the classroom, right? At the beginning stages of their life. I never thought that I would be able to go and work at a school and never have to step foot in a classroom. And I have to say that I'm not necessarily built for a kindergarten classroom, maybe for a 9th grade classroom, but I'm experiencing that right now as we're going through, this pandemic, that I help in the kindergarten classroom, and it's for 2 hours a day. It's actually the most training moment of my life, which is something I love and also I laugh about daily. And then, I realized, and I kind of, when I started working at a nonprofit that was education related, I was like, what else is there out there in the world to do that is not in the classroom? And admissions was something, I think many people, if you ever ask them who do this work, you're like, how did you get into this work? Oh, I fell into it, right? And that's literally kind of what I feel, but I also feel that I fell into doing this work because I needed to know the inner workings of how decisions were made, from an equity lens, from an access lens, and obviously, like, you learn a lot. And I always tell people, I said, if you don't feel comfortable talking about money, and particularly like tuition increasing, you don't feel comfortable kind of having to make a choice that is going to balance the budget of the school, that can be really, really hard. And so, I mean, I do this work every year knowing that there's a board that makes a conscious decision on how much tuition increases or it doesn't increase, right? And most independent schools in the country, to be very honest, even in 2008, when the market crashed, there are very few schools in the country that said we're not going to increase tuition, right? Because that is the, that's the way you pay the bills, it's the way you get faculty and staff, increases. And I think that many families are like, this is a value for us that really matters. We want our teachers to get paid, so we'll do that. But now we're also in another pandemic, which is most schools in this country are actually having the opposite conversation of like, how do we not maybe increase, or we increase it very little because we want to make sure that our families, we're not pricing our families out, right? Which in many parts of the country that's already done. But I just kind of knew that I wanted to do this work. I love people. I love talking to families. I love kids. And I actually believe, as a person who doesn't have any children who one day hopes to have them, is that educational opportunities, the K-8 experience, is one of the most important pivotal moments of a child's life. And I think, when I tell families about, people think college is really it. And obviously I think that you should pay money for your kids to go to college. But I think parents and people think like it's college, right? And it's high school. It's actually not. It's preschool through 8th grade that are the most formative educational years of a child's life, that are the most important. And so when you spend your money, you should actually spend your money on those years. If you are going to tuition charge in school, your child, I always tell people this, is that your child can go like to the school where they shoot every single day and go to Harvard. But if your child doesn't have the foundation that they need, they're going to have a very difficult time playing catch up in high school and college.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very true. So I'm going to wrap 2 of the questions actually into one.
Sure.
Because they're both relevant. So how has the field of education, at least the field that the subfield of education that you're in, how has it changed since, well, really since you graduated and since you entered it? And then what advice do you have for current graduates who want to get into this piece of the field?
Yeah, the first question's not hard. I think that independent schools have historically, the founding of them were very exclusive. So they were not intended for people who look like me, people who were poor, people who were not privileged. And that's not to say that that hasn't changed. It definitely has changed. And that's one thing I would say from the point of when I started this work until now. I would say that I see more people who look like me in the classrooms, who are in leadership roles. So I see more diverse boards, which I think are extremely important in the sense of really thinking about the growth and the future of an institution. I would say, one of the biggest things higher ed is, every higher ed institution in the country is having really, really difficult times of figuring out enrollment, right? And which is something that I'm really passionate about. But I would say independent schools, honestly, like we opened the school in August and we were over enrolled, right? In a pandemic. So I think that what's changing is that families are realizing the importance and the difference of independent school education, right? And they also, I think that parents are looking at their children, and they have 3 children, and realizing that we're not saying that each and every child needs to go to independent school. We're saying that each and every child is different. And so one child can go to public school and thrive, one can go to charter school, and one might need to go to independent school, right? And we want families to understand that. And that's one thing that I try to convey to families is that, one, I'm a public school advocate, and I believe that public schools deserve to thrive and students deserve to have as many educational opportunities as possible. I also think that families should have the right to choose, and that they should not feel like because of cost they can't look at independent school, or because of the neighborhood they should look at the school that has less resource but the better one. So for me, I believe in educational access, and I don't look at a family and say, well, you're turning against your neighborhood because you're going to independent school. I think that many families, particularly families of color, are choosing independent schools because they're thinking about the level of resources and tools that their children will have to grow and to really be as figureheads in the world, right? And so I'm not mad about that. Obviously, we are places of privilege. And that's one of my favorite things to say to families. I'm like, we're a place of privilege, and I don't ever deny that. In a pandemic, it's more obvious now than it's ever been that we are doing things that public institutions have not been able to do, charter schools cannot do. We're opening. Most of us are opening to capacity to allow students to come back to return in-person learning. That is absolutely a privilege. When you think about, I live in a place, live in Oakland, where the public schools are talking about they're gonna open in January, right? We have literally, that may not happen because that costs millions and millions of dollars to put up barriers and all these things. Like, education shouldn't be a privilege, right? Which is why I do this work, and I try my best to use a DEI lens and to make this education as possible, as accessible as possible for families and kids that we can serve. When I think about advice, the one thing that I would say, and this actually, I'll give a shout out to actually a person who's here because I learned from her this part. So Hannah actually told me about a firm called Carney Sando, and so that was my kind of like, I knew what I wanted to do. We kind of had these side conversations, and they're a headhunter, and it doesn't cost you any money on your end to use them, but they will help you through this journey, right? I also think it's extremely important to network. I think that, as particularly for Earlham students, I think that even when people think about finance is off-putting, but I'm like, there's many great things that you can do great in the world of finance, right? When I think about education, yes, you don't only have to go the public school route. It might be great if you're a recent college graduate and you're like, I don't want to move to a major city and pay for housing. Boarding schools are always looking for young professionals to kind of work in schools and like do the things that are extremely, extremely important. And if you love working with kids, I always recommend that. So Carney Sando is great. And then there's, these other bigger search firms that like NIMNet, which is particularly focused on people of color. There's Strategenius, which is also particularly focused on people of color as well. But, Carney Sando is the big one. The National Association of Independent Schools is a great resource. New York State Association of Independent Schools is also great. I think that people who are interested in this area should really think about education as a broad stroke. Like there is not one direction of education to go, right? If you want to be a classroom teacher, obviously independent schools need classroom teachers. And I always encourage, I have so many, students who are now in college who are thinking about the next steps in their lives. And I always tell them, I'm like, you'd be great in an independent school. Like you want to be a classroom teacher or you want to do admissions, you'd be great in an independent school because the tools and the level of autonomy that you're given, I think are just not connected in the sense of what public education does. And when I say public education, I mean particularly a lot of testing in the sense of like, this is the book. When I think about George Floyd or I think about what's happening in the world about Black Lives Matters, independent school teachers, if they wanted to, could stop what they're doing and talk about what's happening in the world without worrying about a state test at the end. And I think that's, to me, when you think about the world, if you want to really make change, I think that we need more people who are, Earlham grads, honestly, in independent schools, because at the end of the day, we're educating about, 1% of the world, less than 1% of the world, but the 1% of society who have resources and wealth are sending their kids to independent schools. Most of them are not sending them to public schools. And so when you're the face or you're the voice or you're the person who's impacting the student's life, there's a really good chance they're going to go out there and do great work because they had you in their life in some capacity. And so the advice I have is that, when you think about, oh, these places are privileged, right? There are a lot of Quaker K through 12s in the country, Quaker schools that are doing amazing, amazing work that charge tuition, right? But they still need great educators and they need great people to work in them. And so I would say, yes, it can be daunting. And I would say even when I was at Earlham, I didn't necessarily know that this is going to be my route, right? Like all my friends who were like, I'm going to be a teacher, they were like, I'm going to work in a public school. But I knew for myself, and I think, many people see this, like when you do, masters of teaching, or any of those kind of graduate programs, a lot of them are very much geared towards public school education. And I actually, the one thing that kind of moved me away from public school education was, I was like, I don't want to teach to a book. I don't want to take this test. I don't want to do that, right? There's so much more to a learner. And you can feel that when you're doing the teaching programs that even you are kind of belittled in a sense of like the tools that you need to be a great educator. And I really think, when I think about a previous boss, when I worked at A Better Chance, she said to me, she said, a graduate degree is great. Like those are so essential and awesome. But I'm also more intrigued by the experience and the skills that you bring to the space. And I think that's important too, is that, a lot of independent schools, are looking for like, what are the skills that you bring? What have you done? How are you going to be involved? And I think that Earlham students particularly are suited for independent schools as well, because you have so many things that you do. You're service oriented. You care about diversity, equity, inclusion. Social justice is important. There are schools out there that actually fit that mode of what you want. I think about places like, Putney or, Westtown or George School. There's so many places out there that really can fuel your soul, but also give you what you need as a working professional.
Mm, wonderful. So you've referenced Earlham a few times. I'm really curious about what Earlham experiences, classes, anything like that that has really impacted your journey so far, both professional, personal. You can really expand on that however you want.
Um, so it's really a funny one, actually. Um, I would say, just in general, I think not necessarily a class, but Earlham always, I mean, when I think about the work that I do and the reason why I continue to stay at a place like Redwood Day, is that it's student centered, right? I think that any educational place that exists that does that, there's a good chance that I'm really intrigued about what you're doing. And I feel like our mission is solid. I feel like the work that we do is visible throughout every action that we take. And so, for example, when I think about a community, I think about a community, I have a head of school. So, obviously colleges have presidents, but our head of school is basically our president. And he listens to what people have to say. He makes a decision based on, we're trying to open during a pandemic, and so obviously you don't just say we're going to do this and do that, and that's not the way that we function. It's like, what do you need? What will make you feel comfortable? What can we put in place to make this happen as well? So balancing the needs of the students as well as the adults. And I would say the many opportunities that I had to talk on panels about my Earlham experience, right? And also knowing that I was the center of the bedrock of this institution was really empowering for me, in the sense that, like, not me as a person, but me as a student. And, I feel like, taking seminar classes, like what I got in college, and when I went to, independent boarding school, what I got in prep school and when I got in Earlham was what I feel education should be. I think you should have small classes. You should have thoughtful experiences. You should have people who care, right? And this is why I went into the level of education that I went into, because we see students every day. We also understand that they carry very unique things in their lives. Some kids don't have any worries. Some kids are, their families are spending their last discretionary resources to make sure that they get an education like this. And so I'm really mindful of that. I think about, Mary Lacey or Stephen Butler. I think about Joanne Quiones. I also think about Benita, and I think about Mary Garman, for example, who did a womanist feminist class, theology class that I really enjoyed. I think the classes that push me, and I think that Earlham in general, just like the education that I received, or just being a student there, I was pushed, and not to a corner. I was pushed down a path to seek my truth, and always being a true seek of my own purpose, right? And so, um, I would say all those things combined really put me in a position to say, this is what I want to do with my life. I knew that I always wanted to be a director at some point when I got into this work. And I also knew that I wanted to be a part of the decision making, right? I have to run, we have about a $2.5 million budget for financial aid, which obviously for us is a lot of money, but we have, 418 kids. And every day I'm very mindful for that every single one of our families could choose to be somewhere else. And I think, with I identify as a Quaker, I'm a convinced Quaker. And, those values inherently of just like, seeing the light of everyone, um, understanding that we are good people, that we're all good people no matter what we've done. And that is really important to me when I'm thinking about making a decision. Like, I know that no matter what, kindergarten or sixth grade or first grade, that I'm impacting, I'm shaping someone's life. If I say no, it's impacting them in some way. If I say yes, it's impacting them in some way. And so for me, I think that the one thing that Earlham has really done for me has really shown me that you want to follow what you feel is right, and you want to be able to explain why you made the decision that you made. And so I feel very confident in the work that I do, that when I have to tell a family like no, or I tell a family, it's a wait list or it's an accept, then I'm able to clearly explain why we offered a space to your child or why not. Um, and so I think that whole overall Earlham experience taught me that my life was going to be meant to serve people and to be with people. Um, and I couldn't do anything else. Like I think about it often. Sometimes like I'm gonna go do something else. But every day when I get to wake up and do this work at a school that really speaks to my heart, I don't think, I don't take that for granted. I'm not looking at the other side and say, oh, the grass is greener. I don't think the grass is greener anywhere else. Like when I leave this place, if I ever leave, it's going to be for something that is, I cannot say no. And right now I'm saying no many times because I love what I do. I love being where I am. Um, and when you spend so much time at work, as I explained to families who are going through this process and their child enrolls, your child spends about 8 hours a day at school. I spend more than that at work engaging with people. So like a community is really important. This is my community. These are my people. And so the fact that I'm super excited to see them every morning, I smile through my mask, obviously. I get to laugh and joke with these people and break bread with these individuals. This is a community. And I think that anyone who's thinking about any kind of job, honestly, like you should be thinking about the level of community. When you spend, 20 hours, or 40 to 60 or 80 hours a week at work, the community does matter, not just the paycheck.
Yeah, wonderful. Um, so you kind of already answered the question I was going to ask next. I was going to ask kind of where you see yourself in your next steps, but
Sure.
you kind of already. So I'm going to rephrase it and actually phrase it as what you said. So for considering your next steps and where you
Mhm.
might go in the future, what could you not say no to?
Yeah. So for me, interesting enough about independent schools is we're also these are like incestuous places. So like everyone knows everyone. And so at the end of the day, like I have friends who work in independent schools and we all know someone who knows someone and all those things. So for me, I think the opportunity that I couldn't say no to is, I definitely am my final kind of independent school goal is to be a head of school. I would love to run an independent school in the country. I think that an assistant head, so pretty much working directly with the head of school, is something I'd be like, oh, can't say no to that. But for me, it's not just title, right? I think that if I could get all the things that I want out of the next opportunity, but the community is lacking what I need, but there's a whole bunch of money on the table, I'm not necessarily concerned about a whole bunch of money, right? I've been in positions before where I've made a whole bunch of money and I said, this is not the place for me. I'm in a place right now where I feel like I'm a part of a community. I'm seen, I'm valued, I'm heard. I live in my truth every day, right? I'm a queer Black man working in independent schools and predominantly white spaces, and I show up the way that I am, and I talk about the fact of like my dating life, or I talk about the fact of being queer, and to talk about race and class and gender. If I couldn't do those things in an institution, that's not a place that I want to be, and so I think it has to be an opportunity where I'm like, this is a time in my life. I'm 32 years old. So I feel like, it has to be an opportunity where I would expect maybe it would be later in life that I would have that, but it's coming sooner. And I would really, really consider it. Right now, my next step is hopefully graduate school. And so I'm actually going through that process right now of applying to graduate school, which is interesting to think about because I've actually been through this many times and instead of applying and getting into a program and saying, okay, great, and something shift or change. And I'm in a place in my life where I know this is the time. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind is that when you're thinking about the next steps in your life beyond your career, you're like, I want to go back to school. I want to learn. It has to be the right time. And I say it has to be the right time, regardless if someone's funding it or you're paying for it or whatever, you're taking loans or whatever out. It has to be the right time in your career. And for me, I'm at a place where I'm really, really happy, but I also don't want to not learn. And so I'm looking particularly at programs that are kind of low residency, and independent schools have a lot of programs that they're connected to, and higher ed institutions have a lot of programs that are geared towards independent school professionals. And so I'm looking at something that will allow me to continue to do the work that I love, but also allow me to continue to grow and develop and foster skills that I don't necessarily have. Like, I'm a director of admissions, which, 20 years ago, you could be a director of admissions, you can never really be a head of school. Now that's shifting. So
Yeah. Question from Jason in the chat, which is actually the question I was going to ask, is what programs are you looking at? And I asked this mostly as a graduate school masochist myself.
yeah.
I've am now in my third grad program, so I'm very curious about what you're looking into.
Yeah. So, so I know, which is why I think I waited so long to actually eventually like this is it. Um, I know that I want to be ahead of school, and so will I get into these programs? I have no idea. So that's the thing. They're also super competitive. So I'm looking to study independent school leadership, and so there are three programs right now that I'm looking at. So Columbia has a program called Klingenstein, which is probably one of the most premier programs in the country for independent school leaders and people who are interested in leadership beyond the classroom or kind of their leadership role currently. And it's, studies have been done that is a place where, people of color who are heads of school, majority of them have a master's from Columbia. I'm also looking at UPenn, which is also an independent, they have an independent school or a public school track. So I'm looking at the independent school track. And then I'm looking at Vanderbilt as well, which had just started a program that's similar to that as well. And that's of interest to me in the sense of growing, developing. I want to be challenged. And so for me, name is in independent schools will actually matter. So like you go to Columbia, people are like, oh my God, you went to Columbia, right? You went to UPenn, you went to Vanderbilt. People are super excited about those things. And so I understand the power and privilege of a name behind my name. But I also know that I want this year or whatever, or 2-year program to be something that's really meaningful and thoughtful and also exciting. I go back to the fact of, I think I delayed my educational journey beyond undergrad because I can never find anything close to replicate my Earlham experience in the sense of, thoughtful faculty, people who cared, really deep dialogues. Like, I don't want to be in a classroom with people because they all just want to be at Columbia, right? I want to be in a classroom because these people all want to grow and develop, want to be challenged and pushed, over the edge of it. So that's kind of, that's my trajectory, hopefully.
Wonderful. That's really exciting. It looks like we have another question from Grace. I was actually just about to open it up to audience questions, but it looks like we have a question from Grace. Do you have a teaching certificate? If so, could you speak quickly how the process was after graduating from EC? If not, has it affected your career in education?
Yeah. So, interesting enough, and I actually think that's another pointer. And I think that a lot of Earlham students kind of knowing this will be helpful in their own path. So in independent schools, there are very few. There are obviously some in the country that, love the qualification that you have certification and those things. The beautiful thing about independent school classroom teachers is that you do not have to have certification. Most teachers, and when I mean classroom teachers, so say if you have a degree in English and you want to go teach English, that is the focus, right? If you have fine arts, you're probably not going to be teaching English unless you at least have a minor in it, right? So, the great thing about independent schools, and there are some public schools around the country that do have this, there are a lot of independent schools that have fellowships, associate programs, so you're pretty much working with a head teacher, learning the skills, what it means to manage a classroom. That's a lower school experience. And so those people who are associates or assistant teachers are typically in a graduate program or about to start a graduate program. That's a very East Coast thing. I'm on the West Coast where our teaching assistant program is for people who obviously have an interest in working with kids. You don't have to be in a graduate program or about to go into one. For a lot of people who are like, I'm going to take this leap of faith, I think that's definitely something you should look at. I would say, generally they don't tend to pay a whole bunch of money, but for the experience and the mentorship and the leadership that you get, I think there's no costs associated with that. I made no money out of after graduating from Earlham in general my first year, so which I'm not mad about that at all. And I think in general, if when you're thinking about kind of middle school, upper school, for example, work, I don't even have a graduate degree. And I think one of the most important things is when you're thinking about going into education, I think about my career trajectory. For me, it was really important to see how far I could take my bachelor's before I had to move to the next step. And right now, I know I could probably take it a little bit further, but I've already reached a point where it is time for the next thing, which is graduate school. And I think it's really important for people to realize that I don't think there's anything wrong with graduating and going into the workforce, right? Because at the end of the day, I think that it helps you really figure out exactly what you want to do with your life. So unless you're trying to be a doctor or that you want to get a PhD or something like that. Like there are people at PhDs who work at independent schools around the country, and that's totally acceptable, right? But I think that getting the experience that I got is really showed me what I like and what I don't like. And I've also learned a lot about leadership styles that I really, really respect and leadership styles that don't work for me.
Yeah. I was going to open it up to anyone. Hannah, Jason, Grace, Carrie. Does anyone have any questions for Donnie that I didn't ask or hasn't been asked yet?
I mean, I am just, this is like the perfect thing for me. I'm so happy I tuned in today. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I am wondering, how do you balance the fact that this education that you're in is only available to a certain amount of students? And I guess that's one thing I've been struggling a lot with is
Mm-hmm.
I'm an advocate for public education because it's accessible to everyone. But I'm also an advocate for the education that you're working in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Earlham is preparing me for. So yeah, do you have any advice on that end?
Absolutely. I think that in general, for me, it's one of those things where I think that you have to wake up and really be excited about it. So the one thing that I've learned and I've seen, and I always hear because I have friends who are in charter schools, who are in public schools, I have friends who are in leadership roles in charter schools and public schools, and they exactly what you're saying is the reason why they won't leave, right? So I actually have these conversations with my friends all the time trying to make them convert. And I said, well, you might want to come work at an independent school. And a lot of what I've seen is, I've seen friends leave the public school sector and come to independent schools. The average time for most people in public schools is like, 5, maybe 7 years. Independent schools, I'm at a school right now where a person just retired. She'd been here for 34 years. And for me, that is something that's really important. I don't think I want to be at one school for 34 years of my life. But at the end of the day, she loved what she did. So she did our tech, a little bit of a technology, and she also would do cooking with the kids in the classroom, which I thought was phenomenal and super, super exciting to watch. The kids loved it, right? I think that if you're thinking about kind of this is your trajectory, you could try public schools, you can work at independent schools, right? I don't necessarily think that um, you have to choose. I also don't think if you're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, you're thinking about accessibility. Why couldn't you work at an independent school and fight for that, right? And I think that, to be honest, the work that I do, I feel like requires a DEI lens. If you do not have a DEI lens in this work, right, I'm bringing, I'm not trying to bring a whole bunch of kids who each and every kid is privileged in the sense that they can afford to be here, right? Social economic diversity is extremely important. Racial diversity is extremely important. Geographical diversity is extremely important in the sense of like zip codes. And so I think if you find a place that's really doing intentional work around that, there will be no question about where you're going to go and what you're going to do. I think that when you are working in a place where they can't give you clear bounds of their DEI lens and what they're trying to do or moving forward, right? It's really about this is our clientele and this is what we're trying to do. To me, my clientele is who are the kinds of kids that we can educate, and that's it, right? I tell families all the time the only 3 things that I care about when I'm thinking about enrolling a kid is the social, the emotional, and the academic. One, can you do our academic program, all the supports that we have in place? And socially, emotionally, are we a place where you're going to thrive in? And or do we have the tools to help you thrive? And so I think it really just depends. I don't think honestly that you should look at independent schools and say, oh, I can't do this or I don't want to do this, right? Because of all this privilege. I think you have to really think about that. And I think hi Carrie. How's COVID affected your school and job this year? That's a really good question. So, interestingly enough, and Grace, this kind of goes back a bit to your question. So, the pandemic happened in March, and so as an admissions office, we shut down March 16th. I will never forget this day. And 3 days later, I sent out contracts to families to let them know if their children were accepted into our program, waitlisted, or they did not get a seat, right? And so we're talking about for the families who were accepted, I'm saying, hey, you've been accepted, and here's this really large price tag because at the end of the day, we're living through a pandemic. And so families have about like a week to make a decision. So don't get much sleep during that time. My head of school is up, I'm up, my whole team's up. We're sending emails and helping families who are appealing for more financial aid in that process, or families who are saying no, moving to the wait list to take someone else off the wait list. And by the end of that week, we were fully enrolled, right? So we thought we were gonna, break budget, but then we literally hit a target of we were at 420 or something like that. We had never been 420 before. Historically, we've been at 408, the largest. And so during a pandemic and like a global crisis, honestly, we were enrolled, right? And so a few of our area independent schools were going through a range of things and emotions and having, before the school year began, cutting budgets and a range of those things. And so the thing that has shifted in my job right now is that I'm fully online. And so having to figure out ways to connect and engage with families, like we are very much, like I said, a student-centered place. And so that's one aspect of my job. But to be fully enrolled in a pandemic, what I saw and what I see is I've seen families who have access. So these are families who were in public schools, for example, who were like, we're going to stay in public schools, whatever, it's great. The world shut down. And these families who were like, we looked at you for kindergarten, we thought we look at you for middle school, and they literally came back into the pool, right? Because they were using obviously their financial privilege and wealth to figure out the best educational option for their child, right? And so that's kind of that part sometimes is hard, but that's an equity issue of something that we'll still have to figure out. But that's the same thing that happens in some public schools. It's like, well, great, this public school is going to be open. We're going to go here to like the wealthier district because there are more resources, right? Families who have the means typically do that. The families who don't are trying to battle that. And so for us, it's not about, I don't care if you live in San Francisco or you live in West Oakland. If you live in West Oakland, you apply to Redwood Day and your child's admissible and we're able to do whatever we need to do, then your child's admissible. I want you as a family to make the conscious decision if this is the place for you. I don't, unless I feel like this isn't the place for you, I'm not going to say no, right? But I feel like at the end of the day, there's a lot of things you're balancing. And I think the interesting thing is that when you think about a person who does admissions and enrollment, you literally are the biggest financial line item to a school in a sense of revenue stream. And so, for me, my team of three, which is me, my director of tuition assistants, and our assistant, we literally bring in about $12 million of revenue a year for the school. And so that's literally pays people's salaries, benefits, all of those things. And so, yes, I'm not the head of school, right? But at the end of the day, only a small percentage of our annual fund, for example, which is kind of the discretionary money that's raised through that office, covers a percentage. So we cover almost, I think, 90% of the operational budget, or even more than that. And that's a privilege and an honor, and it's also a really, really big responsibility because they're difficult decisions that you have to make. And so my job's changing every day because my biggest job is retention, and to make sure that each and every family who is enrolled stays, and financially they can afford to stay here. So if something changes, like I'd rather keep a family than to have to go find another family who wants to be a part of our community, because that matters to us. And so they're definitely different layers.
I think there's also another question from Jason.
Yeah, how do the challenges facing independent schools and secondary schools compares to challenges facing Earlham? I think it's somewhat like it's different. I really think so. K through 12 independent schools in this country, some schools have really been impacted by the pandemic. You've read about that in the papers. It's all over. And because particularly in New York City, for example, a lot of families have left the city to go to like their country homes. Obviously, these are families who are more affluent, who typically are paying these really large tuition prices, but they've left because they're like, we're not going to have in-person school. The outbreaks are high. We're going to leave, and we're going to do remote learning or go to the local public school. I would say in general, families really do understand the benefit of a K through 12, a K through 8 educational experience. And I think that for families who can afford it, that's where they're gonna put their money. I think that once they kind of get to the higher ed side too, families know how to negotiate, right? They're independent schools. We are very, very different. I like most independent schools, unless you're a boarding school in the country, and very few of those do this, we don't give anything beyond need-based aid, right? And I think, to be honest, that is when you think about a kind of equity tool, like I think that's one of the best things about independent schools is that at the end of the day, if you can't afford it, you can apply for need-based aid. If you can afford it, then in a way, you pay it, right? And that's also kind of a complicated thing. But I also, I'm not bribing anyone to be here, right? So when a family's like, we can't afford it, and we're looking at their PFS, which is the parent financial statement, and they make, $500,000 and their expected family contribution is about $70,000. That's 2 kids to go to our school, right? Which obviously is a lot of money, but at the end of the day, we're not going to offset that expense for you to come here when there are other families who actually are in greater need who cannot afford. And the ones, what I've noticed in this profession as well, is that families who tend not to be able to afford it, the ones who are willing to give us their last cent, the ones who can afford it are the ones who are really trying to like barter. And I always say to families, and I say to people, we're not a used car dealership, so we're not trying to get the best price. This is what it is, and this is what you're paying for. I'm giving you a value proposition, right? And so you as a family have to make a conscious decision. And so I think it's different in higher ed. I think in higher ed, families are going to the table with, this school gave us this offer, right? We have had those conversations in independent schools. So families say, oh, this school gave us $5,000, you gave us nothing, right? And that sometimes say, okay, here's a dollar, here's a bone, right? But we're also really clear with families from an equity standpoint that you are not a financial aid family, right? And so higher ed doesn't necessarily sometimes have that opportunity, or unless you're like top tier. But independent schools, we have a lot of autonomy because families believe that this is the gateway, to Ivy Leagues or to competitive colleges in the country, or to the best high school, or my child, the foundational schools. I always sell that this is the best gift you can give your child is an independent school education if you can afford it, right? And some capacity. Even if you have $5 to your name, you only get $5. I say take $250 if you can and have your child be educated in a school that's going to give them what they need, and not necessarily independent school. Find the right place for your child. And so for me, as a person who works with them, if I ever had children, they would definitely go to independent school.
So I think we might have time for one more question if somebody else wants to ask something.
Otherwise, if you have any other questions, definitely feel free to reach out. Also, Hannah put her information in the box. And I will also put my information in the box too if you want to email Grace. But I think that this is really it's an important conversation to obviously have. I think that's something where I feel like there was a small bubble of us at Earlham when I was a student who were very interested in this kind of work, particularly. And there are people before us. So like there's like Stephen Fletcher, who works at George School, who's been there forever. And there are a lot of Earlham graduates who are at, Westtown. There are a few who were associates at Brooklyn Friends. There's Mary McDowell, which is in Brooklyn as well. There's Friends Seminary in Manhattan. Like there's so many also Quaker schools that are also independent schools that inherently will have the values that you're looking for sometimes. But also be mindful too, is that the culture of the city and the culture of also the community also impacts the way that looks. And so there are schools that are not Quaker, like where I am, that are doing really amazing work. And I'm always willing to be a resource to anyone.
Wonderful.
So can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Or are we out of time? Okay. So you mentioned like how there was a small group of you at Earlham. So one thing I struggled early on in my Earlham academic years, but now I'm a junior, so I found my place, but not having a major dedicated to education in a school that like should have that. I mean, I ended up making my own major, and now I'm a self-designed education major, but I still miss like that community of like co-teachers. Like if I went to CMU, which is Central Michigan a teacher college, right, I would have so many peers going into teaching, and that's one thing I've struggled so much at Earlham with. And do you have any tips?
Yeah.
I mean, Mary Lacey is a great teacher, and I get that from her, but like in terms of classmates, it's hard.
I would say that it really, it just depends, right? So for me, for example, it wasn't actually people in my major, right? Like, so me and Hannah were not the same major, but, I think that just conversations, there are always so many people. I had friends who were artists who were like, I want to go in the classroom, or I want to be an artist. Or I had friends who were like, I want to get a PhD and eventually teach, right? So there's a range of things in education. And so generally I would have this conversation with friends, and I had friends who were like, I want to go, maybe I want to teach, or I want to do this, or like, so I would just have this conversation with friends and really build up on that, in the sense of like, okay, great, you want to do this, you want to do that, here are some tools. I think that also one thing that me and Hannah were actually talking about is actually doing something particularly tailored towards students at Earlham who are interested in education, but also doing a conversation around the independent school process and the journey, right? Because I think that, it's these are, like I said, these are in such places that we all know each other. And so at the end of the day, if you know somebody who works at, for example, someone's mentioning Culver Academy, in Indiana, right? If you know people, someone there, that connection is really powerful. And that's actually how, most places are set up in society, is that when you know someone and they know you can put your resume on top and bring you in at least for an interview, that's really, really powerful. Because let me just tell you, when you're beginning out, you're sending a lot of resumes and cover letters and doing a range of things to really figure out what you're going to get, right? And sometimes you're going to take what you can get. But many people that we know and many people make these leaps are like, oh, I know such and such, I know Hannah, I know Donnie. Like, I would love to work at this school. And it's like, okay, great, send me your stuff. I'll go to the people who are in the hiring committee and say, you need to interview this person, right? Can I promise or guarantee you'll get the job? No, but I also think the level of experience that you get just from the exposure of that is even more powerful than the fact of just getting the job, right? Because what you want to work on is like, okay, great, what did I learn? What did I learn from this process? Even if you get the job, it's really important to refine your skills. It's really important to think about, okay, great, what should my resume look like in that sense of the market, right? Like, I've actually remember when I worked at A Better Chance, one of my classmates actually applied for the job that I was leaving. And she sent in her resume. The director was looking at it and there was a typo, right? She applied for the wrong job and they're like, next, right? That was right. I was in 2011. So like literally pretty much a couple of years after the, economy was crashing, but also nonprofits that paid you pennies were still super competitive in the market because people needed jobs. And so it's really just important that you understand what you want and also your cover letter. Like, even if your community is like, oh, whatever, there aren't a lot of people who are like, I want to go to independent schools, but your cover letter should speak volumes, and the level that you engage is going to be extremely, extremely important.
So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Donnie, thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. And just, for reference for everyone who is watching this in the future, since this is recorded, this will be available on YouTube and we'll have links sent out and, through our website and everything. But yeah, so thank you so much. And everyone have a wonderful evening. Caitlin, I think you can, go ahead and stop the recording. And